In this lesson, we're going to look at the evidence for evolution. So as a review, remember that evolution involves the best adapted being more likely to survive and reproduce. You're going to see those words all the time. All right, and because of this, there's going to be a change in the allele frequency of the population as those more adapted genes are passed on to the offspring. Okay, so first let's look at the types of evidence, and we're going to have three types. We're going to look at the fossil record, anatomical similarities, and biochemical similarities. So first let's look at the fossil record. And remember, a fossil is simply the ancient remains of some organism. And they can show us how species have changed over time and sort of give us a timeline for that change. So here's an example of some layers of sediment. And remember, as you go down the layers, it's going to get older and older. So what this is telling me is that these fish species are the oldest, and that amphibians evolved from fish, and then reptiles evolved from amphibians, and then mammals evolved from reptiles. Now, this is a particular type of fish. Okay, this is what's known as a coelacanth, which is a lobed fin fish. And these are pretty special because not only do many of them have lungs, but their fins also have bones. And they're very similar bone structures to those in our forearms, in our arms. And these are going to be the types of fish that evolved eventually into amphibians. So that grew legs eventually and were able to get on the land. Now, obviously, that did not happen overnight. And so one of the things that the fossil record can really help us with is looking at things called transitional species. And it's actually pretty hard to find these, but we have found a lot of them. And what this individual shows is a transition between a fish and a amphibian. So it's partly fish, partly amphibian, and it's moving onto land. Again, in this case, the fossil record is showing us the evolution of humans. And so when you put all these human skulls next to each other, you can see a general trend over time of changes that have evolved humans into what we know today. Now, when we think anatomical evidence, think of anatomy class. An anatomy class is talking about the different structures within an organism. Think things like bones. All right, so organisms that have similar structures, that indicates that they have a common ancestry. In other words, they came from the same types of organisms. We're also going to look at things called vestigial structures. And these are structures that used to have a purpose, but no longer do anything. And to me, these are probably the best evidence for evolution. All right, so here's an example of some anatomical similarities. And we would call these homologous structures. Because this bat, human, horse, and porpoise all have the same bones arranged in basically the same way, doing a different purpose. All right, so all of these relatively distantly related organisms have similar bone structures. And that shows that although we may not seem to be very related, we all share a common ancestor. Now let's look at some vestigial structures. All right, so this is an example of an ancient human ancestor. And it had a really long tail because it was adapted to swinging in the trees. And then over time, we no longer were in trees and we started to walk on the ground. And so our tail got smaller and smaller, but it hasn't yet gone all the way away. It still remains as our tailbone. Most people are not even aware that they really have a tailbone until you slip and fall and land on it, and then you end up having to sit on one of those little donuts. So this is an example of a vestigial structure that used to serve a purpose but no longer does. Other examples in human beings include your wisdom teeth, which most people end up having to get taken out, your appendix, which doesn't do anything except potentially get inflamed and have to be removed. Things like the small muscles at the base of your hair follicles that you see as goosebumps, but used to be able to raise your hair up when you had fur. So we actually have a lot of these structures that don't do anything anymore, but used to have a pretty good purpose. Here's another example. There are many snakes that actually have small hind limbs. You know, we always think of snakes as having no legs, but their ancient ancestors did, and some of the remnants of those legs are still seen today. Another example is the pelvic bone in whales. So the whole point of a pelvic bone is as an attachment point for legs. Well, obviously whales don't have hind legs, so what is the deal with them having a pelvic bone? Well, they evolved from organisms that did have hind legs and actually walked on the land. And so although the legs have gone away as they've adapted to the water, the pelvic bone remains as a vestigial structure. Now lastly, let's look at biochemical evidence. And this means that it has to do with all species using the same basic biochemistry. We're really talking here about DNA and enzymes. We can also talk about things like similar metabolic functions, things like they do photosynthesis in the same basic way, we do cellular respiration in the same basic way, that kind of thing. And the key thing here is the more related you are, the more similar your DNA is. So here we have a table that shows differences in this protein between different species. Now, if the protein is similar, then that means that the DNA is similar because the DNA is what coded for that protein. So here we have the differences from humans. So obviously humans are the same as humans. Dogs, which are mammals like humans are, have pretty similar DNA. Snakes have less, frogs have even less, and sharks have even less. So what that's saying is we are most related to dogs, at least in this case, and least related to fish.